there's a change underway which I want to talk about with you this afternoon. It's a change in who you have to know, and how long you have to wait, and how lucky you have to be to bring a good idea to life. It's about a new kind of marketplace where gatekeepers do not stand in your way. DonorsChoose.org is a pioneer of this movement, so I want to tell you the inside story of how it launched, and that's going to include the most humiliating and embarrassing thing I've ever done. And then I want to explain how we think that crowdfunding could help to change the education system itself, and how you can plug in to that effort. One last show of hands. How many of you had a teacher in high school who changed your life? Even more of you than bought something on Etsy and backed a project on Kickstarter. That's awesome. I had a teacher like that. Here he is. His name was Mr. Buxton. He was my English teacher and my wrestling coach. And when I showed up as a dorky freshman in high school, Mr. Buxton spoke to me like he would to any adult. If he approved or disapproved of something I'd done, I knew it right away because he didn't have that mask that some grown-ups have when they're talking to kids. If I asked him a question on Wednesday, he'd come back to me on Friday saying that he'd thought about it, and he really had. He made you feel like he wanted you on his team. And looking back on it, I think it was Mr. Buxton who made me want to be a teacher. So 14 years ago, I started teaching history at Wings Academy, a public high school in the Bronx. But the school where I was teaching did not have the same resources as when I was in Mr. Buxton's classroom. Where I went to high school, we went on field trips into the woods. We had graphing calculators for trigonometry. We had the supplies to do just about any art project we did not want for anything. But when I started teaching in the Bronx, I saw firsthand that all schools are not created equal. My colleagues and I would spend a lot of our own money on copy paper and pencils, and we would see our students going without many of the materials and experiences that they needed for a great education. We'd talk in the teacher's lunchroom about books that we wanted our students to read, and a field trip we wanted to take them on, and a pair of microscopes that we needed for a science experiment. What I wanted for my students was Little House on the Prairie. Those of you who only saw the TV show might think I was dumbing things down, but those of you who read the book will remember that Little House on the Prairie is a gripping, unsentimental account of pioneer life. And my students, even those who had never left New York City, they loved it too. But the New York City public school system was not about to purchase the Little House series for each of my students. So every day, I would get up at dawn, and I would go to the copy shop, open 24 hours a day, and I would make photocopies of that day's section of Little House on the Prairie, which probably violated all sorts of copyright laws. And as I was making photocopies, I started thinking about all those resources that my colleagues wanted for their students. And it occurred to me that there must be people out there who'd want to help teachers like us if they could see exactly where their money was going. So using pencil and paper, I drew out a website where public school teachers could create classroom project requests, and donors could choose a project they wanted to support. For $2,000, a programmer who had recently arrived from Poland was willing to code my pencil and paper drawings. The version 1 of our site was super rudimentary. The back end was one page that you'd have to scroll down for like 15 minutes to get to the teacher or the project that you were looking for. To process a donation, I had one of those black boxes that you see at the grocery store when they can't swipe your credit card, and they type in the credit card number and the dollar amount and send it over a telephone line. So it was like PayPal, but by hand. It was a very good thing my students were helping me to get the site off the ground. And then I had to get my colleagues to try out this site and post the first projects. Now, I don't know how it is at the schools and foundations and companies where you work, but at the high school where I was teaching, if you wanted to get teachers to do something, you gave them free food. And what you see right there is my mom's roasted pear dessert. She makes these pears with orange rind and apricot jam and spices, and let me tell you, they taste something delicious. So I brought 11 of my mom's roasted pears into the teacher's lunchroom, and as my colleagues prepared to pounce, I said, hold up, there's a toll. If you eat one of these pears, you have to go to this new website called DonorsChoose.org and ask for whatever it is you most want for your students. Propose the project that you've always wanted to do with them. Sounded like a pretty good deal. Took my colleagues like 2 minutes to scarf the 11 pairs, and then they proceeded to post the first 11 projects on our site. The health teacher, she was the first to eat the dessert, naturally, and she wanted to do a pregnancy prevention project for which she needed baby think it over dolls, which are life-size, life-weight dolls that cry at 3 in the morning and need to be fed and show a teenager what their responsibilities would be were they to have a kid. The English teacher, he wanted to get his students ready for the SAT, so he requested test prep books. Art teacher wanted her students to do a wall-to-wall quilt with each of her students sewing a square, and for that she needed fabric and thread and needles. The other history teacher and I wanted our students to meet Mokhtar Tayeb. He had escaped from modern-day slavery in Mauritania. The New Yorker had done a profile on him and his escape from slavery, and he'd been given asylum and was traveling the United States telling people that slavery still exists in many forms. Well, our students had just finished reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and we thought how amazing it would be if our students could meet someone in the flesh who himself had escaped from slavery. So we put up a project on DonorsChoose to bring in Mokhtar Tayeb, assigned our students that New Yorker profile, and our students got to meet this man. Those were 4 of the first 11 projects up on our site. My aunt, who's a nurse, funded the first project, but I didn't know any more donors to fund the other 10 projects. So I funded them myself, which I could afford to do because I was still living at home with my parents, and they weren't charging me any rent, so I could spare some of my teacher's salary to fund my colleagues' projects. And because I donated anonymously, my colleagues mistakenly thought that the website actually worked. And that there were all these donors on the site just waiting to fulfill teachers' classroom dreams. That rumor spread across the Bronx, and teachers started posting hundreds of projects that needed a whole lot more money than what I could afford by living at home with my parents. I was in a really tough spot, not knowing how I was going to get these projects funded. My students came to the rescue. They could see the potential of this experiment to change their lives at school. And I think they also felt bad for me. So for 4 months, they volunteered every day after school to spread word to potential donors. They addressed and compiled 2,000 letters by hand to people all over the country, telling them about this website where someone with $10 could be a classroom hero. We sorted the mail ourselves to get the cheapest postal rate, and every desk in my classroom represented a different region and was piled high with envelopes. And then we carted the sorted letters to the post office and crossed our fingers. It worked. My students' letter writing campaign generated $30,000 in donations to projects on our site. We were off. Another year went by. More teachers in the Bronx created projects on our site. Donors funded some of them. And then 9/11 happened. And teachers at the schools beside Ground Zero started creating projects on our site to recover from the attacks on the World Trade Center. There was a math teacher whose students' calculators were sealed at the disaster site. Their classroom had been relocated to a basement, and she requested a new set of calculators. There was an art teacher who wanted to bring in an artist from Afghanistan to do after-school workshops so that students could meet someone from that country and learn about that country's history. There was a project from a first-grade teacher whose students had been saved by a particular group of firemen. And these first graders wanted to thank the firemen who had saved them by doing a musical performance in front of their fire ladder company. And for that, they needed musical instruments. There were hundreds of these projects related to 9/11, and I thought that local media would jump on this story. This was right when people yearned to participate in the 9/11 recovery effort. The Red Cross had almost too many blood donations to put to good use, and here was this direct way for people to help. But no reporter would give me the time of day. And I think I must have called 100 of them with no luck. So I figured I'd better aim higher. Holy Grail at the time was the New York Times. They had a reporter covering nonprofits and philanthropy. Her name was Stephanie Strom. I figured if we could get Stephanie Strom of the New York Times to do a story about our site, we would have a shot at big-time impact. So I put together a package of materials, and I mailed them off to Stephanie. I didn't hear back. So I called her up 3 weeks later, and she was nice, but she said that we were awfully small potatoes. She said, you know, if ever I'm doing a story about online charities, which at the time was a new concept, you know, maybe I'll kind of slip you into that list, but I'm afraid you're not exactly newsworthy. Damn. So then I found a directory of the top people at Newsweek, and I called the senior editor there, Jonathan Alter. I called him first because his last name started with A, so he showed up first in the alphabetical directory. And I called him during my lunch hour, and his assistant must have been out to lunch because he picked up the phone. And I said, hey, I'm a teacher up in the Bronx. I started this nonprofit with my students. Do you want to hear about it? And he said, sure. He didn't hang up on me. We talked for 45 minutes, and that night, he wrote a column for the Newsweek website saying that this experiment growing out of a Bronx classroom might one day change philanthropy. So then I called up Stephanie Strom at the New York Times all excited, and I was like, hey, Newsweek saw us as newsworthy, you know, at least for their website, so won't you give us a second look? And then she dashed my hopes. She said, I wouldn't touch your story with a 10-foot pole now that another reporter has covered you. The New York Times does not follow in the footsteps of other publications. Oh, I felt like an idiot for having told her that another media outlet had broken our story. So I wrote her an email apologizing for being so dumb. And Stephanie took pity. She could see how badly I felt. And she wrote back and she said, you know, you shouldn't feel quite so terrible because you didn't have a chance in the first place. Because her editors had asked her to focus on charities responding to 9/11. So there was my last opening. I crafted this email to Stephanie, telling her about all of the classroom projects that teachers beside Ground Zero were posting on our site, focused on 9/11 recovery. And I called her up. I called her over the weekend, so I would go straight to voicemail, and I wouldn't interrupt her while she was on deadline. And I said, hey, this is the last time you'll ever hear from me. If you could just read this one final pitch. Monday, I was back at school teaching, and I checked my email in between periods, and Stephanie had replied. She wanted to come do an interview for a major feature story in the New York Times. Let me tell you, it felt like the skies had opened. My parents raised me to be humble, but this was the New York Times, and I just had to shout. So I forwarded Stephanie's email to my friend, and I said, guess who said you wouldn't touch our story with a 10-foot pole and now wants an interview? That's what hustling will get you. I beat my chest. I talked all kinds of smack. I thought that I'd hit forward. But I had hit reply. And the moment I realized, I yanked the electrical cord from out of the socket to try and turn off the computer. But it was too late. I sent that trash-talking, guess who said she wouldn't touch our story with a 10-foot pole email directly to Stephanie Strom, philanthropy reporter for the New York Times. So naturally, I sent her another email apologizing for being so dumb. And to Stephanie's eternal credit and mercy, she did not hold it against me. She went on to write a feature story for the New York Times saying that DonorsChoose.org might be the future of philanthropy. And since that time, we've been working our tails off to try and prove her right, to have earned her mercy. Today, 63% of all the public schools in America have at least one teacher who's created a project on our site. 1.5 million people and partners have given over $300 million to projects on our site. So there are now 14 million students, most of them from low-income families who've got books, art supplies, field trips, technology, resources that they need to learn. My students and I, when we were working on this experiment in my classroom, we never dreamed that we would one day get to share numbers like these with folks like you at an event like South by EDU. And we sure as heck never dreamed that crowdfunding would become part of the zeitgeist. When DonorsChoose.org began, crowdfunding was years away from even being a word, and now it's a movement. Today there are hundreds of sites where people on the front lines can identify a need they see, propose a project they want to do, secure a microloan for a venture they want to start, and then anyone, no matter the size of their wallet, can become a patron, a financier, a philanthropist. And I'll wager that crowdfunding is only going to get bigger. I'll bet you that within the next 5 to 10 years, crowdfunded projects and ventures will account for a real percentage of our country's GDP. So now I want to explain how we've made crowdfunding work in public schools. When a teacher submits a project for funding, we first make sure it's legit, and we email follow-up questions if anything is unclear about what students are really going to learn. This school year alone, we'll get 250,000 classroom project requests, each of which has to be carefully vetted and reviewed. We used to pay people to do that work, and then we realized that our best teacher users were ready and willing to volunteer their time to vet other teachers' project requests. So now if you're a teacher and you've had 20 projects funded through our site and shown yourself to be an incredibly responsible, responsive teacher, we invite you to volunteer your time to review and authenticate other teachers' projects. Think of it as academic peer review meets Wikipedia. And now that we crowdsource this labor instead of paying people to do it, the time it takes us to vet and post a teacher's project has gone from 10 days, when we were paying people to do this, to 1.5 days, now that our best teacher users are volunteering to become our coworkers. That's the power of pushing intelligence out to the edge, of seeing your so-called beneficiaries as your coworkers, which is what crowdfunding is all about. So now the project's up on DonorsChoose.org. At any given moment, there are about 40,000 project requests live on our site. That's a lot to choose from. So we encourage donors to express a personal passion and look at the projects that match that passion. A few years ago, a writer for Fortune magazine was doing a story on Kiva, and DonorsChoose.org is the two websites that Fortune thought were going to shake up philanthropy. And when I was done talking with this writer, he seemed decently impressed by our site, but he said that his personal passion was saving the salmon in the Pacific Northwest, which is a nice way of saying he probably wouldn't be contributing to our site because education wasn't quite his cause. But before he left the room, I did a keyword search for salmon in the Northwest, and up came 5 projects matching. The second result was from a teacher in Oregon who had created a salmon hatchery in the river flowing by his school, and he needed hip waders for his students to maintain and build out the hatchery. Top result was a project from a teacher on an island off Alaska, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. She wrote in her project essay that she was 45 minutes away from the nearest store by airplane, and her students are native Alaskans, and they had recorded their parents' folktales about salmon and done research on salmon and wanted to share that work with the outside world, for which they needed a printer and a scanner. So here was this guy who had a passion for salmon and 5 projects to choose from. And as a result, those high school kids in Oregon now have the hip waders they need to go into the river and build out their salmon hatchery. Last part of the DonorsChoose.org process is the best part. When a project is funded, we don't give the teacher cash. Instead, we purchase the resources and have them delivered to the classroom. So even if the project is for therapeutic horseback riding for disabled students, we're paying the horseback riding stable, which provides that service. And then every donor, even if they've given just $1, gets photos of their project in action, a thank you note from the teacher, an impact letter from the teacher describing what students are really learning, and a cost report showing how every dollar was spent. Donors who give $50 or more also get handwritten student thank you letters. Our donors get to kind of see and feel the impact that they've had and even correspond with the classroom that they chose to help. Throughout this process, we try to be totally transparent. I'll give you one example. Once in a while, the classroom isn't able to provide those student thank you letters. Internally, we call this a jilted donor situation. Happens about 2 or 3% of the time. And when it happens, we reach out to the donor and acknowledge that we've fallen short, even though they've probably forgotten that they were ever due a thank you package in the first place. And we offer to fund another project of their choice on our dime. That might sound like a fall on your sword kind of thing to do, but most of our donors are blown away that we would proactively apologize for not providing that thank you package. And very few of them take us up on our offer of funding another project for them. But our apology note does often prompt them to make a whole new donation. We once looked at the numbers and concluded that our biggest revenue driver, biggest driver of donations, was screwing up and admitting it. Now, you've been kind and letting me share some anecdotes and human interest stories, and there are some folks out there who think that that's all DonorsChoose.org and crowdfunding are good for. So, some individual points of light, some cute one-to-one connections, some good Samaritan deeds, but nothing that's going to change the system itself. A lot of traditional policy wonks look at our site and they ask, where's the beef? They even worry that our site might let government off the hook by letting private citizens step in when the system is falling short. They might even call us a Band-Aid solution because we're treating just the symptoms and not the causes. Well, this afternoon, I want to respond to that skepticism because I think there are 3 ways that we could help to change the system itself. 3 ways that we could have an impact far beyond the books and art supplies and field trips that we deliver. And each of those ways is one that you can plug into to achieve some of your educational and business objectives. First way we think we could change the system itself is by helping entrepreneurs and inventors, and I suspect there are many of those in this room right now, to introduce new products and services directly to classroom teachers. Now, my sense is that for a long time, at least, until a few years ago, a lot of entrepreneurs and inventors saw K-12 education not as a market where the best product wins. Instead, they would see 12,000 different school district procurement officials and California and Texas State Commission that you had to navigate, and a system where you needed to hire a force of salespeople and lobbyists if you wanted to get your device, your service, your product adopted. And so a lot of entrepreneurs and inventors would turn their energies to other sectors. But now, entrepreneurs and inventors can use our site to directly reach teachers and circumvent the educational industrial complex. I've got 2 examples right here, and I'll be super impressed. You can just shout this out. Can folks recognize what these 2 devices are? 3D printer. What about the second one? Okay, this is the first time I've ever spoken where somebody could guess it. Please speak to me afterward. I want to give you a prize. So indeed, the first image is of a MakerBot 3D printer, and there was a $2 million match offer on our site not long ago for any teacher in a low-income community who was requesting a 3D printer. I remember one teacher whose project centered on teaching her students about the making and the manufacturing and the prototyping of synthetic limbs for wounded warriors. And indeed, you are right. On the right is an image of an open ROV, open source underwater robot, for which there was also a match offer on our site for any teacher who wanted to request that device and take their students 12,000 leagues under the sea. Maybe not quite that deep, but deep enough to experience an aquatic ecosystem that they might not otherwise experience. The Open ROV has a video camera and a remote control so that students can explore the ocean depths. Now, MakerBot and Open ROV are 2 companies that I think would never contemplate hiring a sales force to break into K-12 education. But by using our site, they've been able to introduce 3D printing and underwater exploration to hundreds of thousands of students from low-income communities. And we think that more entrepreneurs and inventors may want to use the same strategy.